A long time ago, I made a video that is going to be very similar to the topic that I'm about to discuss in this video. It was nearly 3 years ago, and it was called I Despise Reading. As the title suggests, yeah, I hate reading. Reading has never been a hobby of mine, and I've never been able to get into any books throughout most of my life, and that's primarily because diverting all my attention towards hundreds of sheets of paper filled with nothing but words on them was impossible for me. Getting into reading was a hobby that I couldn't get into myself, and school definitely made it even worse for me. If you want, you can rewatch the original video I made almost 3 years ago if you want to hear my perspective on things in the past, but for this time, I want to give a bit of an update on how things have changed since then, but I will still try and give a brief description of what happened then. As I've already mentioned, I hated reading. Reading was never fun for me, and I couldn't get into it at all, and the main reasons were because of school forcing me to read, which made it less fun. And also, I'm a bad reader. Well, when I say I'm a bad reader, I'm really bad at understanding what I've read and interpreting what I've said into something that I can describe and explain based on the context I've been given in an excerpt. A little fun fact about me. When I was young, according to my parents, my knowledge was actually pretty advanced for my age. I was good at math, reading, and writing. I already had so much knowledge at such a young age. However, there was one thing I was bad at, and it was probably the most important thing. I was bad at comprehension. I was very good at understanding big words, full sentences, and I could say them all coherently. If you were to ask me to read a full paragraph of words, I can do it no problem. But if you ask me what I just read and what is the meaning of the paragraph, I would have no answer at all. The words just go into my head and they quickly leave once it's over. It's like being able to sing a song in a language you don't know, but with enough practice, you're able to sing it coherently enough that native speakers will understand you, even though you have no idea what you just said. That's like this, but you're reading in a language you do know. So you'd expect I'd understand my own language, right? Wrong. I don't even know what to say most of the time. Anyway, back to the topic. Because I was so bad at reading, it made school so much worse. Whenever my class tried going through a book that no one got to decide on, and we had to analyze everything about it and be able to discuss it in conversation, I wouldn't even know what to say. Every time I've been forced to read books or go to the library and I actually did have an opportunity to choose, I usually just end up picking a random book I find and call it a day, or I just pick the same ones I read over and over again. As I can recall from the old video, I was into Diary of a Wimpy Kid and Robert Munch books because the writing was easy and it had pictures. They were literally the only books I could ever bear to read. I've probably read all the original Diary of a Wimpy Kid books at least 5 times. That was the only time I ever had fun reading in school. But even when school tried to make reading fun, it only put more pressure on me to get everything right. I basically went from someone who can't even analyze any reading to overanalyzing every single detail, worrying that one specific thing I might forget, I may be tested on, and then I end up not remembering a single thing. Once I was finally out of high school and I no longer needed to study the most random ass books I don't care about, maybe now that I'm not forced to read, I can actually start reading for fun? Well, with how many books that have been created over the years, surely I'll find one book that interests me. But how would I know where to start? My first initial thought would be, how could I get into any books if I have no idea what they're about whatsoever? Well, I could just go to the library and search by genre, but how would I know what genre I'd like? I don't want to risk spending time and money on a book that I hated, and let's be real, if I tried reading once and I hated it, I would likely not do it again, which means I'm gonna need a really good book to persuade me. And also, because I was thinking of just getting started into reading, looking at a bunch of words on paper is going to be a thing that I'm going to have to get used to, which was a challenge for me. One of the most important things about books is that they're supposed to make you use your imagination and think deeply about the scenario. Reading books is not just about reading a transcript of a video, but also ingraining that information into your mind to fully understand what's going on. Even as someone who loves to fantasize, imagining a story that's happening by words is really hard, because I don't have the creative freedom to imagine anything I want. I'm only allowed to imagine anything within the limitations of the story, because then my interpretation won't line up to what the author wants. At least in movies, you can see everything on screen. You can see settings, backgrounds, characters, dialogue, and all of that is given to you. No need for innovation. It's much easier to just know what's going on in a movie than in a book, because in a movie, you just need to look at what's happening, whereas in a book, you have to visualize it yourself and pay close attention to all the words you're reading. Otherwise, I'm just reading words on paper with no enthusiasm at all. But I guess it's not all bad. I mean, the good thing about using your imagination for books is that it allows you to really play around with the story and see it in a way that makes sense to you. So I guess movies have a more objective view of the story setting, while books can be anything that the reader takes from what they're reading. But it took me a while to understand that that's a good thing. So, one day, nearly a year ago, my friend started introducing me to some of the books that she's read. She is definitely way more of a bookworm than I am, which doesn't say a lot because I don't read any. She persuaded me to start reading some of her favorite books just so I can get a bit of an idea as to what it's like to be a bookworm or whatever. And so I did. I borrowed her book, sat down with it, and began reading. I admit, for the first few minutes, I was already super bored, but I tried remaining put with the story as best I could because, I don't know, I had this opportunity to read a book, and I actually have someone to share it with as soon as I'm finished. So I committed. I read the book, and suddenly, it just clicked for me. It took me only one book to understand every reason why people love reading. As I mentioned before, the great part about reading is that it allows you to use your imagination and analyze the story in your own way. It's not just about reading a subscript the author intends you to also understand. It's about integrating your own understanding of the story to see the kind of perspective similar to the author, but also adding in your own ideas to it. Not to change the story, but so it makes more sense. And that's exactly what I did with the first book I read. I went through it piece by piece, read through the dialogue, took in the information the author gave when describing a setting, and made mental notes of all the important details in the story so I can remember that for a future moment so the context makes sense. Yeah, I did that. I did all of that. The one thing I thought I'd always hate, and it took me one good book to convince me to change my mind. It actually freaking worked. I don't hate reading anymore. Now, obviously, I'm not going to become the complete opposite of my past self because that's far too drastic, but now I feel like I can actually sit down and read a book without getting so bored to death. As long as the story's actually intriguing, well made, and I'm not forced by school to do it, I could actually enjoy a book. Damn, school really does suck the fun out of things that are really meant to be fun, because it makes me do things regardless if I want to do them or not. Basically, if school forced me to make videos, I wouldn't enjoy making videos as much as I used to because I'm not doing it because I want to, but I have to. Without that pressure, I could do things at my own pace. I didn't have any deadlines and I didn't have any assignments, meaning I didn't have to write anything up as soon as I finished reading and understanding the story. Except, wait, that reminds me. So, as great as it was to finally read a book and enjoy it, that didn't stop me from reading more. And creating more. I was lucky enough to have a friend that was into reading because it helped me get into it. I had access to a book without paying and with some prior knowledge, so I could already get an idea if the story is a good one or not. For the past few months, I've basically been borrowing my friends' books one by one just so I have something to read every time we hang out. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but I was genuinely looking forward to reading each book each time I had a chance to. And the best part, since they're not mine, I don't need to keep them on my shelf. Because if the story drove me insane emotionally, getting a glimpse of that book cover gives me PTSD, because it reminds me of a bad memory, and opening the book again feels like re-experiencing repressed trauma. Where am I going with this? Well, let's just say that one of the book series that my friend introduced me to, it's very depressing and heartbreaking. Why? Because it involves death and grief. And coming from someone who has not long ago dealt with grief, it was like a trigger in my brain. But the story, though, it was so captivating, even though it was kind of hard to read. I legitimately crashed out after reading those books, and every time I remind myself of it again, I just keep telling myself, it's not real, it's not real, it's not real, it's not real. Why the hell am I crying over text on paper? Oh, look at me. I'm a lunatic who had a breakdown over words on paper. I looked at a freaking material made from trees covered with ink and I bawled at it. Well, yeah, if you want to think of it in a physical sense, sure, that's what happened. But my brain didn't imagine it that way. So, what did my brain do to cope? I made a fan fiction. Yeah, you heard me. I made a fan fiction of my own rendition of the story. Not to replace the original story, but to cope with my feelings knowing that this story could have gone down differently. I practically wrote down my own what-if story as a way to reimagine what else could have logically happened. It was something that I wanted. Either no one dies, or the roles reverse so we can get the other perspective. I spent probably more than a week on making that fanfiction, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I actually worked on this fanfiction during my lectures because I was so bored and I needed to kill time. That's how desperate I was to get this fanfic done. And as soon as I was finished and my brain can finally relax, another thing clicked in my head. Now I completely understand why people envision the story differently to make them feel better. Fiction is a strong tool. It makes us imagine things that aren't real, but they're just as emotionally exhausting as the real thing. The only difference is that I'm not genuinely experiencing it in real time because everything's locked behind the fictional world. And one important thing I've learned about this whole thing, a fictional story doesn't only exist by the one who made it. It exists in every person's mind who's ingrained the story and stored it into their memory. And because it doesn't happen physically, every one of us is able to shape any piece of fiction into whatever we want, not as a way to replace the original story, but to integrate your own connection of the story and reinvent it as something so unique to the individual. That's why people make stuff like headcanons, fanfiction, even fan art. It's not the original, but it's heavily based on it. I like to think that every one of us has our own little fictional universe going on in our minds, holding all the unique stories and memories into one singular brain. They don't have to be completely original, but they can be based on existing stories created by another person. And that's exactly what I did. It was the first time I genuinely got into reading and made my own unofficial version of the story, and all I needed was one good book to get me invested. So I guess the idiom, "don't knock it till you try it," is right. Unless the one who's saying that phrase to you is from school. If that's the case, screw it, because school really does make everything less fun.